Congressman Dan Kildee, you've been in Washington 12 years as a member. How has it changed?
Well, it's changed in these 12 years for sure. It's less collegial, more divided. My perspective, though, sort of predates the 12 years that I've been here. You know, my uncle served in Congress for 36 years before that. And so I had this bird's eye view on the place that predates my arrival here. The reason I mention that is it feels as though, in many ways, it's changed as much in the 12 years that I've been here as it did for the entire 36 years that my uncle served. The world has changed. Information technology has changed. The way people consume information has changed. And Congress is a bit of a reflection of that. And so it's less collegial, more divided, more difficult, less functional, but it's the only Congress we have. It's not like I could have run for a better one down the street. This is it. It's what we make it. But I have some frustration as I leave, that it's not the place that the framers intended.
So what are those frustrations and how do you fix it?
So one big frustration is this, I think, misinterpretation of disagreement. The framers were brilliant, even if they didn't know it. They created a system that was intended to try to get every possible point of view under one dome and a process for argumentation of those different perspectives to produce policy. The way a lot of people view it now is that disagreement is dysfunction. What frustrates me is this all or nothing kind of approach to policy making that in many ways the public will encourage, that Congress reinforces, which causes more of that same encouragement coming from the interests and certainly just the public in general. This is a place where compromise is not just a way to get through problems. It is the very foundation of the institution. And now we treat compromise as if it's the last resort to not getting our own way, one side or the other, where it ought to be the starting point, not the rescue mechanism for a crisis.
But here's the problem with that, because the way districts are drawn in the vast majority of Congress, members more concerned about a primary versus a general election. And so if you compromise with the other side, in the back of the mind, that member is going to say, how will it impact me in 2 years?
That's exactly right. The incentives are, in many places, aligned to take the position that actually getting something done is less important than painting yourself in a positive light. You know, that's an instinct that politicians have had throughout the history of democracy. But we have a system now in many states that reinforces that by providing the incentives, sort of the reward for pandering to the loudest voices or the ideology that is predominant, as opposed to doing what leaders do. My favorite professor at Kennedy School of Government, Marty Linsky, said it best. Leadership is the act of disappointing your own supporters at a rate they can absorb. You've got to tell people things they don't want to hear if you're actually functioning as a leader, and there's not enough of that here. The gerrymandering issue, it's interesting to me because in Michigan, the game changed as a result of a ballot initiative that replaced legislative drawn districts with a nonpartisan commission. None of these systems are perfect, but in our state, it's a lot different than it was previous to this, where the districts were drawn and it was pretty well assumed this was a Democratic district, that's a Republican district, and there were almost no real competitive seats. Now we've got competitive seats. That's better for democracy. It's harder for us. I mean, I had to go through a really tough race in 2022, but it shouldn't be about us. It should be about how the system works. And I think we've proven that those reforms can be effective. The other piece, of course, is the outsourced role that money plays. That hasn't been adequately addressed in any place that I've seen.
But you're taking politics out of a very political process. How do you implement that in other states like Louisiana or Pennsylvania, where you have some districts that are very gerrymandered to benefit one party or the other?
Well, I mean, we as Democrats, speaking only as a Democrat, I know it sounds partisan, But we did offer a series of reforms when we were in the majority, which would have included addressing this issue of redistricting, the so-called gerrymandering issue, by creating standards that states would have to adhere to so that they couldn't use the political process in legislatures for politicians to pick their voters, as opposed to the voters actually picking who's going to represent them. But it's tough, and it requires people to have courage to make those changes. And here's the biggest problem with it. If an incumbent benefits from the current system, it takes a special person to take action that will cause them to have to pay a price for it.
When you're casting a vote, have you ever avoided a vote or voted a different way because of the impact it may have on your own reelection?
Not so much on my own reelection. I've never avoided a vote. I learned from the best. My uncle Dale served in Congress, and he had the best voting record, maybe absent one other member in his 36 years. So you vote. You've got to vote. That's what we're here for. But I do have to balance very often, like what my own predisposition is on an issue and what the majority of the people I represent feel and how they might be affected. And so long as a vote doesn't violate my conscience or a strongly held principle, then I often feel free to say, look, I can argue this both ways. My district feels strongly about this. That's the direction that I'll go. But equally, I have cast, and I know lots of members do, cast a lot of votes knowing that there's going to be a lot of blowback back home. And that's just part of the job. If you want to do this job, you got to be willing to do that.
And when you go back home, typically, do you spend more time with elected officials and party leaders versus constituents? How do you balance that? It's
a bit of a mix. We typically do meet a lot with the local elected officials because, they've got an ear to the ground that, is, really, really close to the people. But business leaders, but I got to tell you, the most important input is the stuff we get at the grocery store. People have gotten pretty good at figuring out how to keep you from getting away from them. Like they'll hold on to your grocery cart until they make their point. It's being a member of the community, being in the community, having those informal conversations that I have found to be most effective. And that sort of flies in the face of the way Congress used to work. The new Congress, since the 90s, is one that spends much more time back home being a member of that community than moving here to Washington, taking up residence, and only going back a couple of times a month to sort of check in. Now, there are some trade-offs that come with that. But I actually think on balance, the way it's worked for me, going home at the end of every votes session and just being a member of the community, it's the best way to get information.
But conversely, if you're here more, does that allow you to develop relationships with those on the other side of the aisle? And is that a hindrance when you come in on a Monday night, Tuesday morning and leave Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening?
It's one of the big trade-offs that we've had to make. And even though, I prefer to have more collegiality, more comity among members, unless we figure out a way to try to organize that better, it tends to push us into our own silos, our own sort of affinity groups, because as sort of the interest groups operate in Washington, the events that we go to are very rarely bipartisan. It's one of the reasons that David Rubenstein hosts dinners at the Library of Congress that are bicameral, bipartisan dinners to hear interesting speakers, authors on important topics. That's like a reason I mentioned it. It's one of the few true bipartisan events that are still on the calendar here in Washington. But in the old days, not only was it different in terms of how much time people spent here and their families grew up together, but it wasn't as divisive. There was a more common understanding of facts with a different perspective in addressing those facts. Now we're living in a world where people don't have a common understanding of facts and we don't spend time with one another. And I think that's what has contributed to so much of the frustration that a lot of members like I've experienced.
So, Congressman, you've been in the middle of this now for more than a decade. For those constituents back home in Michigan, is it as bad as it is portrayed in the media, the dysfunction and the bitterness on Capitol Hill, or is it better than many people may perceive?
Well, that's a good question, because I actually think it's better than people perceive. Because as much as what I've just described is a description of some of the dysfunction, it's the dysfunction, sort of the more exotic characters of Congress that get disproportionate attention because it's more entertaining. What's not particularly entertaining is that, like former Congressman Fred Upton, a Republican from Southwest Michigan, he and I became good friends, did legislation together, successfully addressed some really important issues, but you rarely see a headline in a newspaper that, airplane lands safely on runway. And what we're doing is, under all of this cacophony of noise, we're still getting some things done in a bipartisan fashion, but they're not the big things, and there's not enough of it. But it's still there. The spark that was lit by the framers still is there. We just need to find a way to give it more oxygen and not fall into the trap that we seem to have fallen into.
How do you feel about leaving Congress? What's going through your mind?
I admit to have mixed emotions because I love the institution. I've been associated with it in many ways since I was 18 years old, since my uncle was elected to Congress. And I've got a lot of good friendships here on both sides of the aisle. Mostly Democrats, admittedly, but I have a lot of good friendships. I'll miss that. I have an incredible staff and a sort of alumni of staff that have become like family to me. I'll miss them. But I'm mostly just thrilled to be going home, to be a full-time Michigander, to spend more time with my grandkids, to do some important work back home, but to be able to go into northern Michigan and hunt and fish and do the things that I've kind of missed out on for the last couple of decades.
You keep talking about your uncle. What did he teach you?
He taught me civility more than anything else. I mean, he was a teacher before he became a full-time political figure. But the thing that he taught me more than anything else is not so much ideology, because he and I didn't agree. He's passed away now. Didn't agree on everything. But he taught, what I hope I learned from him is that you can have a big disagreement with somebody, but you can still respect their essential humanity. You can still treat them with dignity and respect. The term dignity was a term that he used in everyday language. He believed in the essential dignity of every human being. And I came here with the idea that I'm going to walk a different path than he did. I certainly have a different style than he did. But if there's one thing I tried to carry on, I hope I did, it's that. It's the ability to behave in a civil fashion.
Let's address another issue that I think bedevils Congress and Washington and our politics, and that's money.
Yeah.
There's way too much money in the process, and yet you have First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, and that's the argument when it comes to these campaign finance laws. What are your thoughts about the issue of money in politics and the problems it poses for you, not you in particular, but members of Congress either running or seeking re-election?
It's a real problem. I mean, it's kind of interesting because we have campaign finance laws that put limits on what individuals can contribute to a campaign, full disclosure of who those people are. And the political campaigns of candidates and incumbent members of Congress are bound by that. And if that was the world of money in politics, I think we'd be in pretty good shape. But over the last decade or two, especially in the last decade, the amount of money that is spent in politics that works completely outside of those restrictions make the campaign finance laws that our campaigns live with seem inconsequential. I had a very tough election in 2022. My district's a slightly Republican-leaning district. I'm a Democrat. We spent about $6 million that I raised. My opponent, who was largely self-funded, spent $4 or $5 million.
One seat.
One seat. But that was just the money we spent that was under the subject of full disclosure. Everybody could see. But there was at least that much money spent by outside interests that are not restricted to those same constraints. And nobody knows where that money came from. I mean, I could argue that I know where it comes from, but there's no public record, really, of where that money came from, whose interests were at play. And we're coming to a point where these campaigns that members of Congress and their challengers run operate in this world that is almost quaint compared to the volume of money and messaging that is spent with unregulated money. The decision by the Supreme Court some time ago, the Citizens United case, opened the door, I think, for more unlimited money. We've offered a solution to that, a policy solution. But again, it's difficult to get people who are in office who benefit from a system to try to take that system on. And until we do, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for us to find a way to set aside some of the vitriol and focus a little bit more on compromise when the incentives through the redistricting work against it, and the incredible money, unregulated money, that has more to do with the outcome of these elections than the money that we raise and spend, continues to be a bigger and bigger force. Even since my race in 2022, it's exploded even more. There were races where tens and tens of millions of dollars being spent for a 2-year seat in Congress. That's not what the framers had in mind.
And I'm curious, you mentioned 2 years. Some have said maybe members should be elected every 4 years. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I used to be more open to it, but I actually think there is something to sort of the genius of this balance between the way the House and the Senate operate. And of course, we have certain jealousies over the Senate. It's mostly the 6-year term. But each Congress has kind of its own character. I'm from the class of 2012, and we've had a series of, discussions. We had a dinner last night to bring our class together. What's interesting about it is, if you really did a deep dive on each of the classes of Congress as they come in, they have a character unto themselves. They have a unique set of common characteristics that are the product of the politics of that moment. The 2012 class, I think we had this sort of more pragmatic, less ideological approach. The 2018 class, which is the class that brought us to the majority, a very national security focus for them, a much less ideological, more centrist sort of sentiment that they possessed. The 1994 class, the reform class that ushered Newt Gingrich in, that had a character unto itself. So I think there's a value, even though I sometimes am upset by what that produces, there's a value in having one branch of the government, at least part of it, being a more immediate reflection of the politics of the moment, and then have the other checks and balances to try to offset, what a parliament with a 2-year term might produce. The framers intended it for it to be difficult to get things done here, because they didn't want government to impose itself upon people unnecessarily. They may have overperformed in terms of making it difficult to get things done.
And we've seen a lot of that. Congressman Kildee, let's talk about the leadership that you've worked with: Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn. Have their expectations changed over the years from when you first came 12 years ago to perhaps where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, they're all products of the system that worked more functionally. And so I think they've shared some of the frustration with the really effective leaders. I mean, this is where sort of the balancing act of long-term leaders versus, a more quick rotation of leadership, I think, kind of comes in. Nancy Pelosi in particular, I think will be recorded in American history as an important figure, in the sense that she was able to do more with less than just about anybody that I've seen in American history. When I say more with less, produced big legislation with modest margins. That is a tough gig And she's demonstrated the ability to do that. And of course, Steny was a part of that as our whip and as the majority leader when we were in the majority. Jim Clyburn, sort of the resident historian of the place. They all made a huge contribution. And I feel really fortunate to have had the chance to serve with them. The most important person I ever served with was John Lewis. But those three are very much of that same ilk.
Let me ask you about the institution. A lot of people say, let's return to regular order. Other critics say, way too many committees, way too much bureaucracy. You have the chance right now to modernize, to fix Congress. What would Dan Kildee do?
Well, I'd take up some of the ideas that came from the Select Committee on Modernization that my very close friend Derek Kilmer helped to lead. And it's just sort of marginally playing with the rules in a way, not playing with, but modifying the rules so that members are empowered to overcome sort of the institutional bias against bipartisanship. There is an institutional bias against it. But say, for example, as the Modernization Committee proposed, that if a group of some number of Democrats and Republicans, let's say 20 each, 10 each, come together around a piece of legislation, that's a remarkable moment. That bill ought not be prevented from at least getting a hearing or a vote on the floor of the House because the Republican or Democratic leadership isn't satisfied that it satisfies their interests. Something like that empowers members to overcome the institutional biases in favor of partisanship would change, I believe, would change the way leadership has to view the members. And I'm not necessarily being critical of leaders because that's their role in many ways. It's the unique leader that figures out a way to overcome this. But I don't think we can plan on that. I think we would be better off if we had a set of procedures that empowered members who work in a bipartisan fashion to at least get a fair hearing for their ideas. That would be one big step forward.
So how do we get there? How does that happen?
It's leadership. It takes a moment in time when either through the leverage that we have or through an extraordinary leader coming forward and thinking down the road, that they are willing to put that sort of a new idea on the table and make it become part of the rules. You know, it could happen, you know, if in fact we get to this place again where one party or the other can't seem to get a speaker elected. One of the ways we could deal with that is to say, okay, let's have this conversation, but maybe before we decide we're going to help out here, we should have a discussion about how we're going to protect the rights of the minority and particularly the rights of members who are more willing to work together rather than that's the situation we have now, which we've seen, empowering some of the most outrageous, least productive, some might even say deranged members of Congress who have extraordinary authority under the current rules. Why not give extraordinary authority to the most thoughtful, bipartisan, moderate members through a tool like the one I just described? To me, that is going to take leadership or a moment where the leverage is required so that somebody in the minority can say, if we're going to play ball, we're going to change the rules of the game.
But your party had that moment nearly 2 years ago. It didn't happen. Why?
Yeah, I wish it had. I think part of it is we didn't necessarily see it coming quite the way it did. I mean, I knew they were going to have problems, but I didn't think it was going to be that severe. When it came to the debt ceiling issue, we had some leverage, and we were able to deal with it, but only within the confines of the budget parameters that we work within. But I think the moment will have to be seized upon if we're ever in this situation again. That is not the preferable way to do it. The better way to do it, I believe, is for somebody to exercise leadership that gets elected to a leadership position, maybe the top two leaders of the House, if they happen to be in a position where they can have this discussion and say they're going to disappoint their own supporters at the rate they can absorb by changing the institution for the better, even if there may be a political price that they would have to pay.
You mentioned the budget. You probably know this, but it's been nearly 30 years since Congress passed a budget on time and sent it to the president. Bill Clinton was president at the time. Newt Gingrich was speaker at the time. Why can't you guys do it on time?
It drives me nuts. I mean, I'm not an appropriator, so I'm not going to, necessarily go after the people who can't seem to put their bills on the floor. But a lot of it has to do with this environment we're in. Why can't we get these things done? It's because the 12 appropriations bills, we can get usually 7, 8, 9, 10 of them passed. Even though some of us might vote for or against them, they get passed. But there's always a couple where the incentives are such that the vote for that bill comes with a political price that members are not willing to pay. And that's part of this information ecosystem that reinforces, voting no. And the easiest vote to explain is no. There's always a reason to vote against some of it. None of this stuff is perfect. Easiest vote to justify is a no vote. That's one piece of it. But there's not really a penalty that anybody pays for not getting their work done. This is probably the most important example of where compromise is always the solution, but it always comes at the end. Like we've not gotten a budget done on time. We always do get one done, and it's always, at least in my experience, a bipartisan product. Because that's the only way it gets passed. Even if it's a series of short-term resolutions or an omnibus that is not the true enactment of a budget through the appropriations process, the end product, in my time here, has always been a bipartisan product. So the question begs the question, what can we do with the rules and the procedures to empower more thoughtful members to force to the floor the bipartisan product, which ultimately will be the law, earlier in the process? I understand why people are frustrated, because I'm frustrated. I'm right here in the middle of it every single day. And it's like right now, just for an example, we're facing a budget deadline, December 20. There are 435 members of Congress. Every single member of Congress, if you probe them deeply, they know basically what the deal is going to be. Basically. Because it's going to require, even with the Republicans being completely in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House, everyone knows that Democratic votes are going to be required to enact that bill. Everyone knows it. And so it gives us kind of a sense that there's going to be some trade-offs. We maybe not know what the specifics are, but there are going to be a series of trade-offs. Why can't we do that now? I've been encouraging my Republican colleagues, and there are many of them who believe this, that let's have the conversation that you think we're supposed to have in March, in December, and while we're at it, deal with the debt ceiling issue, another issue that's going to be very tough for, particularly for the Republican Party to deal with when it comes up sometime late spring, when all the extraordinary measures are exhausted. We know it's going to be a bipartisan product. There is no functional majority in the hands of either party. And I wish I had a better answer, except to say that these reforms that Congressman Kilmer and his colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, contemplated would empower the thoughtful middle to at least get a vote on some of these compromise bills earlier in the process. We could put, for example, an omnibus bill on the floor of the House of Representatives. Probably would pass with a pretty good majority on both sides, if we could empower a group of Democrats and Republicans to do some negotiation among themselves and not leave it to the majority to always be solely in the position of determining what gets a vote on the floor of the House.
Two final questions. You mentioned the debt because it is approaching in excess of $36 trillion. A pox on both parties, Democrats and Republicans bear responsibility. How do you change that trajectory?
It's the toughest question that we have. We have to be, let me put it this way, as Democrats, we have to be willing to protect the essential functions that we think are important to create an equitable society, but be willing to look at ways to conserve spending where we can, even though that's a tough one. On the Republican side, we're going to have to deal with the revenue issue. The tax code is a part of this. The third leg of this is to engage policies that grow the economy. We mentioned Bill Clinton earlier. When we were actually able to get those budgets passed on time is because we had a surplus. For a rare moment, we had a budget surplus. We need to get back to that, and that is going to take leadership. It's going to take bipartisanship, because if both parties aren't willing to hold hands and deal with some realistic constraints on spending that don't pass all of the pain on to the most vulnerable people in our society, and realistic changes in the tax code that will require Democrats to compromise somewhat, but have Republicans willing to accept the fact you can't fix this without increasing revenue, and doing so in a way that grows the economy. That's not an impossible technical task. It just requires a kind of commitment to one another that so far hasn't arrived here.
So finally, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm about to give you enormous power. You can fix our political system, big or small. What's your recommendation? What would you do?
Number one, I would apply the gerrymandering reforms that we did in Michigan to every state. Number two, I would reverse the decision of the Supreme Court that empowered unlimited private money to completely overwhelm the regulated money of political campaigns. I would consider a reform of multi-seat constituencies, districts, that would allow for more than one voice from an area to be heard. That has a way to empower the minority. That would be a big reform. But the hardest one, and one that you personally probably know more about than I do, is to try to address, in a way that respects our constitutional rights to free speech, try to address the splintering of information delivery, of the curation of information that reinforces people's biases, and find a way, and I don't know what the answer is, except that I know that it has to happen to solve this problem, to get closer to a common set of facts over which we can have an argument over the way we address those facts, to create I guess you'd look at it as a Venn diagram that has a much higher level of overlap in terms of a common set of understandings about the issues. Because if you go over to this building and watch the debate, most of the argument is members telling one another that they don't have their facts right. Not that their judgments about those facts are wrong, but they don't accept one another's facts. The previous points that I made are technical changes to the political system. What I just described as the biggest problem is a societal problem over which Congress only has limited control, but it's one that going unaddressed is going to make it really tough for us to deal with.
Really interesting conversation. Congressman Dan Kildee, congratulations on your retirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.